Hey, what's up, everyone? It's me, Denise from Live Rehab. Thanks for being here. This is my series on dealing with addiction and recovery while in this pandemic. So today I want to talk to you about what to do if you are in a crisis. Okay, so a crisis is complicated. And a crisis doesn't necessarily mean that there's not like a one-size-fits-all definition per se, or a situation that qualifies as a crisis, right? So it's more about your ability to handle something really awful that is happening, or a feeling that is happening, to a point where you feel like there's nothing else that you can do but deal with that very situation in that moment, okay? So, you know, this could vary from person to person. So if you're experiencing something and you feel like you're having a crisis, don't feel like it's not a crisis because you know somebody who has gone through something very similar and they dealt with it in a very different way. Okay, so for example, if somebody loses a member of their family, or has somebody pass away that's close to them, you can see that there's such a broad range of the way that people deal with grief, that for some people they can just kind of deal with it in the moment and then pick up where they left off and move on, whereas other people it may take a really long time to process the information and to be able to move through that. Okay, and that could be put grief, that's just an example, but there's a lot of other examples like breakups, just things like that, anxiety. And we are in a major world crisis right now. So this world crisis is just adding that fuel to the fire to whatever else you may be already dealing with, especially in with your addiction and recovery. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that you can deal with crisis, but the important thing to know is that if you feel like you are having a crisis, you probably are, okay? And don't approach it as like, oh, this isn't bad enough, or I'm not having a crisis or whatever, because it's much better to just face it and be like, okay, this is a crisis, and how am I going to now work through this, okay? So there's a few ways that you can work through it if you feel like you're in a crisis, okay? So the first way that you'll want to approach it is to see if you can work through it on your own. Okay, and on your own means maybe you have a list of like go-to things that you can do, whether it's watching something on Netflix, taking a shower, taking your dog for a walk, running on the treadmill, things like that. So I want you to start brainstorming now, when you're not in a crisis, because it's much easier to think of those things and use that list when you're not in a crisis than it is to try to come up with things when you're in a crisis, because when you're in a crisis you can't really deal with all of that. You can't think clearly, and you can't come up with those ideas when you're in that moment, okay? And those things can also mean, relying on your social supports too. So if you, maybe on your list is like FaceTiming a parent or a friend or whatever. So that's the first layer, and if you can get through a crisis on your own, that's probably going to be the best the best case scenario, or the best way to kind of move through that. But there are times when you may not be able to deal with it on your own, no matter how hard you try. And that's not something to feel bad about, but it's something that you need to know and understand, that there's more layers that you can add on to this in case this first layer of dealing with it on your own doesn't work. Okay, so the next layer, if you can't deal with it on your own, if you've tried a couple things and it's just not working, is to seek immediate crisis support. Okay, so there's quite a few different ways that you can do this, and it really just kind of depends on where you live. But immediate crisis support is either going to be calling or texting someone, or like texting a hotline or calling a crisis hotline. Now, a crisis hotline or a crisis text line, these are organizations that are primarily run from volunteers. So on the other end of it, you'll get somebody who is volunteering their time and who is able to kind of work through that hot moment with you. And the end goal usually for a crisis like a hotline or a text line is for somebody to help get you from this really hot, heated moment to a much calmer moment. So you're kind of working through that crisis, and then you can start to move past the actual crisis feeling that you have onto something more long term, right? So keep that in mind when you if you do need that. It's not a substitution for like long-term therapy. It's really just somebody on the other end helping you on their own times. And most of the time the volunteers are not professionals. They working in a professional environment. They are really just there to offer support, and they do work. Crisis lines, crisis text line, it works. People hundreds of thousands of people every day are able to get through their crisis situations just by calling somebody or texting somebody. Okay, so sometimes though, that doesn't work either, right? So you've tried to work through it on your own and that didn't work. You've tried a hotline or a text line, that didn't work. So the next layer of that is to go to your professional supports or your professional network, and you may or may not have something established already. But if you do, if you have a therapist, or if you're working with like a counselor or a social worker, it's important to call them and see if you can get through to them and ask them like what you should do, what your next step should be. Okay, so there's that professional layer. Now, when a crisis is really bad to the point where you feel like you are unsafe, if you are like suicidal, if you feel like you want to harm yourself, or you feel like there's literally nothing that you can do to move past this, then that would be a point where you would want to consider emergency help. And really, considering emergency help should be the very last resort anyway, but especially during this pandemic. And I don't want to discourage anybody from getting emergency help if needed, or if it's something that will save your life, because your life is important. It is just a little riskier right now because of the pandemic, and if you were to call for emergency help and they send somebody out and then you go to the hospital, you just really don't know who you're being exposed, who's exposing you as far as the coronavirus, especially in a hospital. However, if you are unsafe, you need to not worry about that, and you do need to call for emergency help, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you are alive and that you're here for another day and that you can get through your crisis, okay? So don't worry about that, the pandemic, if you really are feeling truly unsafe, okay? But just to reiterate, start with these layers first before going to that extreme measure. And if it gets to that, it is important that you do call for emergency help, okay? So in the comments below, I'm going to post some links to some national crisis lines, but the best way if you want to talk to somebody over the phone, the best thing that you can do, you can Google crisis lines, because it really, again, it depends on where you live. These hotlines and stuff, they're different numbers for your country, but there are some main ones that I can post. So there's crisis hotlines that you can call on the phone. There's texting that you can do through text messaging, and then there's a lot of messaging like through certain websites and stuff where you can get support. So if you have, just to give you an example, if you have a crisis and it's dealing with something specific, you can always Google that specific scenario, and you might find something in your area that can help with it. For example, domestic violence, you can search for a crisis domestic violence hotline. You can search for self-harm, suicide. You can search for LGBT if you're having a crisis related to that. So certain things like that. So The best thing to do though is to have those numbers handy again before you have a crisis, so that way if you do end up needing it, you're not like just kind of in this daze like what do I do? How do I find those numbers? And you're searching, and a lot of times people it's too complicated when you're actually in the crisis to do that. Okay, so that's all that I have for you today on my talk about how to deal with a crisis. I will see you in our next video. Bye, everyone.